So today we're talking about panpsychism, and this is the idea that everything in the universe is conscious. Now, this might seem like a good idea. However, we're going to see that there is a big difference between saying that everything in the universe is conscious and the universe is mind, that this is a mental universe. Now, there's a very big difference. Now, I know that on the surface that they seem very similar, but they're actually very different. So panpsychism, now remember, there's many different types of panpsychism, so keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about basically the most popular and the most generalized version of panpsychism. And basically what it says is that everything, all matter in the universe has a conscious or sentient aspect to it. And this is very different from Hyperionism, which is an idealism that says this is a mental reality. Because remember, panpsychism just says that all matter has a mental or sentient aspect to it, but not that necessarily that mind is primary. So you see, that's a very big difference. And another big difference is that within panpsychism, we start talking about consciousness and sentience, and that's very different from something being just in general minded. So panpsychism is a very interesting philosophical position, and it's headed in the right direction, but we're really going to take a look at it and pick it apart and see what it is, where it goes wrong, and how we can understand reality in terms of a mathematical idealism, which is Hyperionism. So let's take a look at some excerpts from an article on panpsychism to better understand this position. So, in our standard view of things, consciousness exists only in the brains of highly evolved organisms, and hence consciousness exists only in a tiny part of the universe, and only in very recent history. But according to panpsychism, consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. So, according to the mainstream view of things, how people generally think of consciousness, I am conscious, you are conscious, but a great portion of the universe is not. Panpsychism says consciousness is everywhere and is a fundamental feature of it. Now, this doesn't mean that literally everything is conscious. The basic idea is that the fundamental constituents of reality, like perhaps electrons and quarks, have an incredibly simple form of experience. And the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow derived from the experience of the brain's most basic parts. So this would be the idea that perhaps the most basic material particles, such as electrons, quarks, have a conscious aspect to them. Now, here's an important thing that we need to discuss, is what is consciousness? Because this gets incredibly confused because nobody agrees on the definition of consciousness. As we're about to read and I'm about to show you here, the way they are defining consciousness, I would say, is incorrect. Let me just read this quick excerpt and then I'll elaborate. So it might be important to clarify what I mean by consciousness, as that word is actually quite ambiguous. Some people use it to mean something quite sophisticated, such as self-awareness or the capacity to reflect on one's own existence. And as I'll say, that is our position. But continuing to read here, this is something we might be reluctant to ascribe to many non-human animals, never mind fundamental particles. But when I use the word consciousness, I simply mean experience, pleasure, pain, visual or auditory experience, etc. All right, so this is an important thing to understand. The philosopher speaking in this article, in this excerpt, is not defining consciousness in a way that I would agree with. So, how this philosopher is describing consciousness, they mean simple experience. Pleasure, pain, auditory. This is not consciousness. This is sentience. So we already have a word for being able to experience qualia, having a qualitative experience. That's sentience. We shouldn't be calling that consciousness because it's not consciousness, it's sentience. So, I want to make it clear that when we're reading from this philosopher who is a panpsychist, every time they are saying consciousness, they actually mean sentience. So again, what is the difference between consciousness and sentience? Consciousness is the ability to self-reflect and plan for the future in an explicit way. So someone who is conscious has developed a sense of I, and they can create simulated future possibilities in their mind. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you are planning out your day, and you can have different things, right? Perhaps you just woke up. You can either continue sleeping in, or and let's say you have to go to work. You can continue sleeping in and skip work. Or you can go into work. Or you can go into work, flip off your boss, and quit. But what you have the ability to do is simulate these future possibilities and place a simulated version of you, I, what Julian Jaynes calls an analog I, and imagine what would happen in these various scenarios. You can imagine, oh, if I were to go to work and flip off my boss, that would feel really great. Oh no, but what am I going to do about income? Or I could continue to sleep in and that would be really great. Or, oh no, I'd lose my job. Or, oh, I could start my own business. Or, see what you have done, you as a conscious entity have developed an analog I, a model of yourself, and you can place that model into various simulated future trajectories, future possibilities, and then you can rationally consider them and weigh them and see what would be the best. So you have this, it's very sophisticated. You have this sense of I, you can plan for the future, you can reflect on the past, you can rationally weigh various options because of your ability and because you have created this analog I. This is more or less how Julian Jaynes defines consciousness and how Hyperionism defines consciousness. It's a very sophisticated process. Now, contrast to that to a very, very basic animal. Animals can't do that. But animals can have an experience. They are hungry. They, see. They have a visual field. They see objects. They experience pain. They experience pleasure. The ability to have a subjective experience, that's sentience. But you see, that doesn't involve consciousness. They don't have to have developed a sense of I that they can then plan for the future and rationally weigh out different possibilities. So you see, there is a very big difference between consciousness and sentience. So, now, I just really want to get the difference here between consciousness and sentience, because in just a moment we're also going to bring in a third thing that we have to define, which is just mind. Because there's a difference between consciousness, sentience, and just mind. But for now, all right, just understand the difference between consciousness and sentience. Very important. And realize that in this article, whenever the philosopher says consciousness, They actually mean sentience. So when they say consciousness pervades the universe, what they really mean is that sentience pervades the universe. And so when they are saying that an electron might have a conscious aspect to it, they don't mean that the electron has a sense of I and awareness and can think explicitly about future possibilities. What they're saying is actually what they mean is that the electron is sentient. It has some form of basic experience, a basic subjective element to it. Okay, so that's very different, and that's something to get clear right out the gate. So continuing, humans have a very rich and complex experience. Horses, less so. Mice, less so again. As we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. Perhaps at some point the light switches off and consciousness disappears. But it's at least coherent to suppose that this continuum of consciousness will fade, but never quite turn off, carries on into inorganic matter. With fundamental particles having almost unimaginably simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature. That is what panpsychists believe. Okay, so again, he says that consciousness is on a spectrum, which is true, and it gets lower and lower and lower, and that inorganic matter has a conscious aspect to it. Now again, this is not how one should use the word consciousness. What this person would be saying is that inorganic matter has a sentient aspect to it. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand here, and the difference between panpsychism and Hyperionism, which is an idealism. So panpsychism, what does that mean? Panpsychism, sort of that mind is everywhere. So panpsychism says matter has a mental aspect to it. Basically, matter and mind go hand in hand. And they're talking about sentience. Now, Hyperionism, which is an idealism, says that mind is fundamental, that this is a mental reality, that matter is an illusion that comes from mind. So, for example, in Hyperionism, you could have only mind and no matter. Panpsychism, that's not the case. It says that matter exists, but it has a mental sentient component to it. So you can't get rid of the matter. They're sort of paired together. Now remember, I'm talking about, there are many different versions of panpsychism here, and I'm talking about the most prevalent ones. But, you know, so some versions of panpsychism might vary, keep that in mind. But I'm talking specifically about, you know, a popular version of it. So that's another thing that's very important to keep in mind. So, we've talked about consciousness, we've talked about sentience. Now let me talk a little bit about just mind in general. So according to Hyperionism, are electrons, is organic matter sentient? Because this is basically what panpsychism is saying. Well, no. No, not necessarily so. Electrons and inorganic matter are not necessarily sentient. But you might be thinking, if everything is mind, why aren't they sentient? Well, you can have something that is mind, but not sentient. For example, a thought. If you have a thought That thought is mind, but it's not sentient. So right now, if you close your eyes and imagine or think about an apple, that apple is mind. That apple is a thought. It's mind. But it's not sentient. That apple doesn't feel pain, but it's mind. So in panpsychism, in the version that we're talking about here, an electron has sentience. In Hyperionism, an electron is a thought. So in Hyperionism, everything is mind. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is sentient. Minds, monads, are sentient and can have the capacity for consciousness. Consciousness is something that evolves from sentience. So, do you see the big difference here? In panpsychism and what have you, an electron, quark, whatever, could be sentient. In Hyperionism, it is a thought. And again, think about closing your eyes and imagining an apple. That's a thought. It's not sentient. But guess what? A thought belongs to a mind. You are a mind that has the thought of an apple within it. So a thought belongs to a mind. So an electron is a thought, which means it belongs to something. So when you go to sleep and dream at night, you have a dream, and you have many different dream objects in your dreams. There are dream chairs and dream trees and dream apples. And these things aren't sentient, but they are your thoughts. They belong to you. So if you had a dream electron in your dream, that dream electron thought would be a constituent of your mind. So what about objective reality? Objective reality, what we call the holos, an electron is a collective thought. So when you go to sleep and dream, that dream is composed of your personal frequencies. The holos is composed of all of our frequencies, all of our thoughts interacting together. So an electron is a collective thought. It is the thought of the universe, the absolute, all of our minds working together collectively. So all matter are frequency complexes that originate from us as the monadic collective, from the source singularity. So an electron, yes, it's mind, but it's not sentient. Not necessarily so. Not necessarily so. But it's a thought. And because it's a thought, it still has a mental aspect. It still has an inner aspect to it. So that's why in quantum mechanics, things behave like they're minded, like they're thoughts. Because when you get to that fundamental particle level, that the mental nature of reality really starts to show itself. So far we're seeing big differences between panpsychism and Hyperionism, which is a rationalist mathematical idealism. Again, remember, in the version of panpsychism that we are talking about here, it is saying that sentience pervades all existence and that matter and mind go hand in hand. Hyperionism, which is a rationalist mathematical idealism, says that mind is primary and some things may not be sentient. They are thoughts. They are mind. So again, really important to understand the difference between consciousness, sentience, and mind. And it's important to have these things defined, because look what happens when we, like in this article, when you start using all these words interchangeably. Well, that's not good, because these words all mean something different. And you don't want to start using them interchangeably because they're all very, very different. So, despite great progress in the scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complex electrochemical signaling is somehow able to give rise to the inner subjective world of colors, sounds, smells, and tastes that each of us know in our case. There is a deep mystery in understanding how What we know about ourselves from the inside fits together with what science tells us about matter from the outside. And this is an incredibly important point that so many people don't understand. The vast majority of the public thinks that science has most things figured out pretty well. But the fact is that the aspect of you that you are most familiar with, and the aspect of you that you are only familiar with, is your subjectivity, your ability to have an experience. But guess what? Scientific materialism is completely 100% unable to explain how consciousness can arise. Well, they go, oh, it's an emergent property of the brain. That's what they'll say. That's what they'll tell you. Well, when you get a certain arrangement of neurons, it becomes an emergent property of the brain. But this is, they don't ever say how. It's a very hand-wavy, jargon-filled way of saying, we don't know and somehow it happens. Because if you posit, as scientific materialism does, that the world is only matter, well, how does subjectivity arise? Which is fundamentally different from matter in the materialist conception of matter, from that paradigm. So basically, this is where panpsychism comes in according to this article, and the reason why this philosopher is working on panpsychism is because it's wow, science has absolutely no clue how subjectivity can arise. This is a huge problem that needs to be fixed. And essentially, in a nutshell, what it's saying is science is broken. Materialist science is broken. So maybe panpsychism is the answer. Instead of saying everything is matter and that's it, well, maybe matter and subjectivity go hand in hand, and that's how subjectivity arises, because we get a complex subjectivity from basic subjectivities. Now, panpsychism is not correct, but do you see how they're headed in the right direction? At least. They see, oh, this is broken. This philosopher, at least, is heading in the right direction. Everything being material and that's it is broken. We need to introduce a fundamental subjective element. They don't do it in quite the right way by introducing sentience and not declaring the primacy of mind. But do you see the point? While the problem is broadly acknowledged, many people think we just need to plug away at our standard methods of investigating the brain, and that eventually we'll crack it. But in my new book, I argue that the problem of consciousness results from the way we designed science at the start of the scientific revolution. So, how does panpsychism allow you to approach the problem differently? The starting point of the panpsychist is that physical science doesn't actually tell us what matter is. And this is very true. And this is another one of the very hilarious things, is that, scientific materialism states that, oh, everything is matter. Well, define matter. What is matter? They can't do it. The classical definition of matter in Newtonian physics is completely different than how modern quantum mechanics approaches matter. Matter was originally thought of as sort of these little hard pellets that clump together in a very atomistic view, going back through, the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus and all this, the Greek atomists. But in quantum mechanics, it was revealed that matter doesn't behave like matter at all. It behaves a lot more like mind. And so now materialists have no way of defining what matter is. So the starting point of the panpsychist is that the physical sciences don't actually tell us what matter is. This sounds like a bizarre claim at first. You read a physics textbook, you seem to learn all kinds of incredible things about the nature of space, time, and matter. But what philosophers of science have realized is that physical science, for all its richness, is confined to tell us about the behavior of matter, what it does, not what it is. Physics tells us, for example, that matter has mass and charge. These properties are completely defined in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. Physics tells us absolutely nothing about what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of matter, what matter is in and of itself. And nobody understands this. Nobody realizes how fundamentally broken physics is. Or they at least don't realize what physics is for. Physics is a model that tells you how the physical reality behaves. It does not tell you what anything is. Do you see the difference between how something behaves and what something is? You can tell me all sorts of things about how a certain thing acts, but what is it? Sure, you can tell me how a baseball travels through the air in this universe, but what is the universe? What is reality? What is existence? Absolute silence. People don't understand this. And this is why we have to realize that scientific, atheistic, materialist empiricism is a broken, failed paradigm that cannot and will never tell us what reality is. Only a new system that incorporates mind, which is Hyperionism, which is ontological mathematics, can do that. That's why when science replaced faith, Hyperionism and Ont math will replace science. It's an old, outdated system that fails at answering the question of existence. So it turns out there is a huge hole in our scientific story. The proposal of the panpsychist is to put consciousness in that hole. Consciousness for the panpsychist is the intrinsic nature of matter. There's just matter on this view, nothing supernatural or spiritual, but matter can be described from two perspectives. Physical science describes matter from the outside in terms of its behavior, but matter from the inside, that is in terms of its intrinsic nature, is constituted of forms of consciousness. What this offers is a beautifully simple, elegant way of integrating consciousness into our scientific worldview, of marrying what we know about ourselves from the inside and what science tells us about matter from the outside. So when I studied philosophy, we were taught that there were only two approaches to consciousness. Either you think consciousness can be explained in conventional scientific terms, or you think consciousness is something magical and mysterious that science will never understand. I came to think that both of those views are pretty hopeless. I think we can have the hope that we will one day have a science of consciousness, but we need to rethink what science is. And that's so important to understand. In order to have a science of consciousness, we have to throw out the current paradigm and introduce a new paradigm. That's why Hyperionism, that's why ontological mathematics is the science of the future. And here's a really important point that I want to point out here. And another aspect that is a mistake. So, I'm not going to read the entire thing here, but essentially, what a certain part is saying is that a key moment in the scientific revolution was Galileo's declaration that mathematics was to be the language of the new science, that the new science was to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. But Galileo realized that you can't capture consciousness in these terms, as consciousness is essentially quality involving phenomena. So basically what the argument here is from this panpsychist is basically saying, well, that physics is all about mathematics, but mathematics can't explain consciousness. And so we have to have a new way of looking at things. But here's the beautiful part about Hyperionism, and this is another part where this philosopher goes wrong, is that we can understand that mind and mathematics is the same thing. And once we make that connection, that this is not only a mental reality, but it's a mathematical reality. And what do I mean by mathematical reality? Well, this is a reality made of sinusoidal waves, frequencies, frequency patterns. And this is how we define mind. But mind and mathematics in Hyperionism and ontological mathematics is living. It's alive. Abstract mathematics you learn in school, it's dead. They're just scratch marks on paper. They're empty abstractions. But in Hyperionism, mathematics is ontologically real. That means it's alive. That means a number isn't just a scratch mark on paper. It's a frequency pattern. It's a thought with an inner and outer aspect, a mathematical form, and a qualitative internal aspect to it as well. And so, this means that we can understand reality rigorously, rationally, and strictly. Just like with what physics does with mathematics for the physical world, ontological mathematics can do for the mental world, the world of mind. So do you see the beauty here? And the superiority of Hyperionism and Ontmath to at least this particular way that this panpsychist is looking at panpsychism. First of all, mind and matter aren't fundamental together. Mind is fundamental. So you can almost think in Hyperionism, matter is derivative of mind. And this is how this is understood through the Fourier transform. Reality is frequency patterns, sinusoidal waves, and when you apply Fourier mathematics to this, you can transform frequency into a space-time representation. So frequency looked at another way through a Fourier transform results in our space-time representation, what we call matter. But it is derivative and relies on mind. So, mind is primary, mind is fundamental. This is a mental reality, this is a mathematical reality. In the panpsychist view, it's like this matter-mind, not even matter-sentient hybrid. Chunks of material that have sentient aspects to it. Hyperionism is an irrationalist mathematical idealism, which says this is ultimately a mental reality. Mind is an illusion, or matter is an illusion generated from mind. And that all reality isn't necessarily sentient. All minds, monads, are sentient. But all is thought, which originate from minds, monadic minds. So the really great thing about this is seeing how flawed science is and how some people, some philosophers, modern philosophers, many of the or rather contemporary philosophers, are finally starting to realize this. But the world at large is completely in the dark about this. But Hyperionism and ontological mathematics is the new science that solves all these problems and is infinitely superior to even these philosophical positions. Reality is a living mathematical mind, and we as monadic minds are all nodes of this cosmic mind. Reality is the result of our collective thought, our collective frequencies working together that produces a space-time representation of the world via Fourier transform. And we can understand all of this rigorously through mathematics. And why does this matter? Why should you care? Why should you give a shit? Because it means that you have the potential to become a god. And all of us together, the absolute. If you believe in materialism, you think that you're just a clump of matter that's going to die and decay and go into the grave when you die. But understanding what reality is will completely alter your life and the world. Because no longer Will we model reality based on a capitalistic machine, but a living mind, and will create a new world, new terra, that is about transforming its citizens into the divinity that they have the potential to become? So let's ditch this, machine, dead mentality. In panpsychism, it's a step on the right direction. But the way it's being described here, no, we don't need to make it a weird matter-mind hybrid. We don't need to say that all things, no. Just get rid of the matter. Matter is derivative of mind. This is a mental reality. This is our creation. So let's create the world in our image. That's what gods do. That's what a god does. Let's create the world in our image. What do I mean by in our image? As a mind. We are minds. So let's create a world mind, a connected, interconnected system, an idealist neural network, a divine world where each and every one of us has the potential to be our best selves and to create a society of our best selves. So let's ditch the matter and create a world of mind.